The lost Primarchs of the first founding Space Marine Legions are the two Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions. They were, for unknown reasons, deliberately expunged along with the Astartes of their legions from all known Imperial records and archives before the onset of the Horus Heresy in the early 31st millennium. Referred to as the Forgotten, and the Purged, it is known only that the missing Primarchs and their legions are listed as having been deleted from Imperial records. An erasure from official records is known as an Edict of Obliteration, also called a damnatio memoriae, a High Gothic phrase meaning condemnation of memory. This is the official Imperial policy of deliberately destroying any records, icons, or other symbols or monuments pertaining to an individual or organization, usually of the Imperial elite, who has been declared excommunicate traitorous by the Emperor of Mankind, the High Lords of Terra, or the Inquisition, and a galaxy-spanning empire that stresses fealty and loyalty to the Emperor in return for advancement, acclaim, and spiritual salvation for its elites. This is perhaps one of the most severe punishments. The complete and utter erasure of all records of the legions is considered by Imperial historians as the most successful Edict of Obliteration ever carried out in Imperial history. A rare record accidentally placed into copies of the Astra Militarum's Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer in the 41st millennium recently revealed that the long-lost legions of the ancient Space Marines participated in the campaigns the Rangdan Xenocides during the Great Crusade in the year of 860 of M30, though the scope and nature of their involvement remains unrecorded. In the short story The Lightning Tower, when the Imperial Fist's Primarch, Rogel Dorn, is in the falls of the Kathmandu precinct of the Imperial Palace and comes upon a series of pillars with plinths that contain life-sized statues of all the Space Marine Legion's Primarchs. He notes, the 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those two absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded? Earlier, less ambiguous sources go so far as to say that information on the lost legions and Primarchs was deleted following the Horus Heresy. The only information Games Workshop has ever released on this subject that directly addresses the mystery can be found in the Horus Heresy novels False Gods and The Lightning Tower by Dan Abnett. This has given way to the theory that the Primarch of the 2nd Legion could possibly be the founder of the Blood Ravens chapter. This theory, however, gives undue importance to the Blood Ravens because, outside of the Dawn of War PC games, they are in no way a significant chapter in the Imperium of Man's history. This theory also does not describe why the Blood Ravens would still be present in the late 41st millennium. Obviously, their forebears had committed some terrible acts of treachery for their records to be completely obliterated, to such an extent that even other legions present at the time presumably also had any of their own records of the lost legions and their Primarchs destroyed or modified. In the novel A Thousand Suns by Graham McNeill, during the triumph of Ullanr, Magnus the missing Primarchs to his brother Mortarion. "Brother," said Magnus, ignoring Mortarion's words, "a great day, is it not? 9 sons of the Emperor gathered together on one world. Such a thing has not happened since." "I know well when it was, Magnus," said Mortarion, his voice robust and resolute in contrast to his pallid features, "and the Emperor forbade us to speak of it again. Do you disobey that command?" Games Workshop has shed a little more light on this subject in the Horus Heresy novel about the word-bearers called First Heretic. It has been established that these missing Primarchs were erased from Imperial records at least 43 standard years prior to the events of the Drop Site Massacre that would occur on Istvan V. This is because only 18 of the established Space Marine legions are referenced during the events that occurred at the city of Monarchia on the world of Kur, where the entire Word-Bearers Legion and their Primarch Lorgar were formally rebuked by the Emperor of Mankind for their apparent laxity in bringing the atheistic Imperial truth to newly compliant human worlds during the Great Crusade. I fear the Emperor will break the Word-Bearers and break me. We would be cast alongside the brothers we no longer speak of. There was also a long-standing rumor amongst the Legion's Astartes that may explain the ultimate fate of the Legions. Around the time that both these wayward legions were expunged from all Imperial records, it was said that the number of the Astartes in the Ultramarines Legion swelled in size until it eclipsed all of the other legions. It is not known if this is merely speculation, or it is established fact that legions of Space Marines were inducted into other legions after they were officially expunged from Imperial records. Though interesting, this still does not explain what actually happened to the Primarchs of the legions. In the anthology, The Primarks, in the short story Feet of Iron by Nick Kime, when the Iron Hands Primarch, Ferrus Manus, becomes separated from his legion and lost in subterranean tunnels, he stumbles upon 20 statues of the Primarchs. Manus recognizes all but 2 of them. Interestingly, the masks covering the heads of those 2 were split and almost destroyed. In the novel Fear to Tread by James Swallow, Horus witnesses the Blood Angel's Primarch, Sanguinius, murdering one of his own legionaries who had been affected by his legion's burgeoning genetic curse, later known as the Red Thirst. Sanguinius confessed to his fellow Primarch that he had been aware of the flaw in his genome for several years, keeping the truth from both the Emperor and his fellow Primarchs. But all efforts on his part to find a cure had, thus far, eluded even him. Horus then inquired of Sanguinius why would he not seek to ask their father to intervene on his legion's behalf in order to cure it. Sanguinius' angry retort to Horus' question implied that one of the lost legions might have suffered from a similar malady, and were therefore purged for their genetic impurity, a fate that he would most definitely want to avoid. In the novel Descent of Angels by Mitchell Scanlon, when Zahariel Elzurias receives a history of Old Night by brother librarian Israfel, he informs the young initiate that their Primarch Lionel Johnson has 19 brothers. Since this novel takes place on Johnson's homeworld of Caliban in the year 840 of N30, this possibly indicates that the lost Primarchs were not yet removed from official imperial records at this time. We are further illuminated on the subject of the fate of these 2 legions in the novels Legion and Prospero Burns. In Legion it is mentioned that a Space Marine Legion had gotten in trouble before. In the novel Prospero Burns, the Space Wolves, Primarch Lemon Rust discusses the inevitable execution of the Thousand Sons for Magnus the Red's performance of an act of maleficarum that drove his sorcery right into the heart of Terra and into the presence of the Emperor. This had revealed Magnus' own supposed treachery through defiance of the imperial edicts banning the use of psychic sorcery at the Council of Nicaea. When asked if he was concerned over the fact that the unprecedented was about to take place, namely, Astartes fighting Astartes, Russ commented that this was not an unprecedented event, implying that his Space Wolves had been called on to perform this task once before. This might be an enigmatic reference to the possible destruction of the legions, or it could be reference to the event known as the Night of the Wolf as mentioned in the novel Betrayer. This was a little-known incident that occurred shortly after the massacre of the entire planetary population of Genna by the World Eaters Legion. Primarch Lemon Russ had been charged by the Emperor to take his Space Wolves Legion to Genna to bring the World Eaters to heel. In the novel Prospero Burns, the character Caspar Hauser also states, "A legion is always strongest at its base. The fortress homes of the Allfather's 18 legions Astartes are the most formidable and impregnable sites in the new Imperium." This statement implies that the missing 2 legions were already gone prior to the burning of Prospero, and thus prior to the Horus heresy. In the novel The Outcast Dead, the character Evander Gregoras, the master of the Cryptesthesians, remarks that because of Magnus' violation of the Emperor's decree absolute from the Council of Nicaea for performing an act of maleficarum, the Emperor would have no choice but to make an example of his wayward son and the Thousand Sons Legion. It will mean the wolves will be loosed again. This statement further vindicates the role of the Space Wolves Legion as the Emperor's chosen executioners to enact his will when carrying out censure against a fellow Space Marine Legion. We are further illuminated in the novel Deliverance Lost, where the Primarch Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard recalls his first meeting with his father, the Emperor. "You and your brothers were taken from me by denizens of the warp before you were ready." Brothers, Corvus was excited by the prospect, pushing aside the questions that the Emperor's answer had prompted. Though he had made many friends amongst the prisoners of Lycius, always Corvus had been aware of his otherness, and when they had started to call him savior, any hope of normal relationships had ended. That there were others like him filled Corvus with hope again. "Yes, you have brothers," said the Emperor, smiling at his son's delight. 17 of them. You are the Primarchs, my finest creations." 17. Corvus asked, confused. "I remember that I was number 19. How can that be so?" The Emperor's expression grew bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He looked away as he replied, "The other 2. He said, "That is a conversation for another day." This revelation indicates that the missing legions were already lost, possibly expunged from all Imperial records by the time Corax was reunited with the Emperor on Lycius. This conversation also implies that the lost Primarchs were more than likely lost in the early years of the Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium, as the Emperor mentions that most of the other Primarchs had already been discovered by the time he reunited with Corax. In the novel, Vulcan Leaves, by Nick Kime, during a conversation between the Salamander's Primarch Vulcan and his equerry Ardalus Nubian on Caradon during the Great Crusade, the Primarch confesses to his first captain that he had seen the darkness in the hearts of his brother Conrad Kurz, the Primarch of the dreaded Night Lord's Legion. Nubian questions whether it would be wise to discuss the matter with either Horus or Rogel Dorn. Vulcan replies, "I am troubled, Ardalus, very much so. None of us wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the great investiture, another brother's name excised from all record. It is shame enough to bear the grief for two. I have no wish to add to it, but what choice do I have?" From Vulcan's reply it can be inferred that the legions were sanctioned and purged for some reason. In the novel, The Unremembered Empire by Dan Abnett, when Lion L. Johnson arrives upon the Ultramarines' capital world of Ultramar, his brother Guilliman pulls him aside to speak to him about his plans for an Imperium Secundus. Located within the Ultramarines' fortress of Macragge Civitas is a chamber with 21 chairs, each constructed for the size of a Primarch and one for the Emperor himself. Each chair back is draped with banners, which displays the Great Seal of each Space Marine Legion. They are lined up at a long table draped with a pennant bearing the Seal of Terra. The Lion takes notice that two of the chairs bear blank pennants that are made of plain, bleached, undyed cloth. L. Johnson comments to Guilliman that it is a shame that two of their brothers will never be able to come to this chamber, in which Guilliman replies, "Yet their absence must be marked. Places must be left for them. That is simply honor." In the novel, Scars by Chris Raitt, White Scars Primarch Jaghatai Khan muses about his two missing brother Primarchs in his thoughts, which confirms their absence. Has this much power ever been concentrated in so few pairs of hands? He wondered. The entire galaxy entrusted to 18 brothers. The peril of it is obvious. In the short story, Lost Sons by James Swallow, 20 Blood Angels legionaries stand sentinel over their homeworld of Baal and its surrounding system, anxious for any word about their missing Primarch Sanguinius and the rest of their legion, which had gone missing 5 standard years earlier during their campaign into the Cygnus cluster by the order of the War Master Horus. They are surprised by the arrival of Tylos Rubio, a former librarian, and now a knight-errant of Malkador. He bears a matte black tube in his hand, the case for a message scroll of Photic parchment. The black scroll is a document of such rare import that it is more legend than eventuality. Twice before in living memory such messages were delivered to the homeworld of a legion's Astartes. This implies that both the lost Primarchs and their respective legions had their own homeworlds, which also implies that they had received such a message of dire import, most likely declaring their respective legions excommunicate traitorous. In the audiobook, The Sigillite by Chris Raitt, Malkador, the acting regent of Terra, and one of his covert agents named Caleb, travel to the dungeons located deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. After passing through many halls which contain relics and artifacts of mankind's past, they finally pass by a massive door, at which point Malkador stops to dwell upon it for a moment. He informs Caleb that beyond this door was where the original lab for the Primarch project was located until a separate location was built. As Caleb approaches the door, he noticed that it is covered in symbols, many of which he recognizes as belonging to several of the Space Marine legions, including the Dark Angels, the Luna Wolves, the Alpha Legion, etc. But Caleb also takes note of 2 symbols that have been scratched out or had been worn away. When he presses his master for answers, Malkador merely brushes it off and states that no one went into this room anymore and walked away. These were likely the icons of the missing legions. In the Horus Heresy, Book 1, Betrayal by Alan Blake, on the inside cover is an ancient galaxy map depicting the burgeoning Imperius Dominatus. It lists all the major worlds that are involved in the galaxy-wide conflict that comes to be known as the Horus Heresy. Every known Space Marine Legion homeworld is shown with its respective location. However, in the Segmentum Pacificus, there is a location listed as the Finding of the Lost Son. This could be a reference to the rediscovery of the mysterious Alpheus, as he was the last Primarch to be found during the Great Crusade, and his homeworld has never been revealed. Or it could be a veiled reference to the location where one of the lost Primarchs was found. There is also a table in this book labeled Space Marine Legions Extant at the time of the Horus Heresy, which lists the legion number, name, and Primarch. The listings for the 2 legions' Primarchs have been redacted. Interestingly, the length of the black markings which redacts the 2nd Legion's name is quite long, indicating that it is barely shorter than Emperor's Children, while the name of the 11th Legion is around the same length as the Thousand Sons. The name of the 2nd Legion's Primarch is quite short, and is nearly as long as the Primarch Alpheus, which suggests only a single name. The name of the Primarch of the 11th Legion is about the same length as Magnus the Red, which suggests either a first and last name or some sort of title or appellation. This book goes on to state, of these 20 legions, steadily expanding in numbers over time, 18 would survive to grow into vast forces by the end of the Great Crusade. As to those that did not, there is a chronological timeline entitled Chronicles of the Final Years of the Great Crusade, which lists the date, event, and the legion that took part, under entries for the dates 965 of M30 and 969 of M30. The events listed say all data redacted, both of which the Space Wolves Legion took part in. Possibly, these 2 events could be when the Space Wolves were sent to censure the 2 legions, as they were known to act on behalf of the Emperor as his executioners, as when they were sent to censure the World Eaters. However, in the novel The First Heretic by Rangdan Xenocides, during a conversation between Lorgar and Magnus the Red that took place a mere 7 solar months after the raising of monarchy, this conversation could imply that the legions had been stricken from all official imperial records for quite some time. If both of these sources are correct, then it provides further evidence that both legions were still active in some sort of fashion before whatever removed them from imperial records. In the Forge World book The Horus Heresy, Book 3, Extermination, by Alan Bligg, when it speaks of the creation and early history of the 20th Legion, the information is fragmentary and often contradictory. During the creation of each nascent proto-legion, each was raised first to active service in a staged process of testing and trials before the full active force was completed through mass recruitment. Each stage of creation would result in an expansion of the gene seed implantation on progressively larger groups of neophytes. The last of these preliminary stages was, according to sources, the alpha induction. This was believed to be the first non-experimental implantation, and its purpose was to create a proto-legion at minimum fighting strength to be field-tested in open battle. It is further stated that at this stage, it is notable that in the case of the Redacted, this process failed. This could imply that one of the lost legions failed early on due to some genetic deficiency in their gene seed. The same source states that there were 3 outstanding theories as to why the 20th Legion was temporarily sidelined at the Proto-Legion stage while their contemporaries underwent rapid expansion and deployment. The second of these posits that there was suspicion that some hidden problem or potential flaw had been discovered which prevented the Proto-Legion's expansion, although this in many ways seems unlikely, for it is to suggest the Emperor was either unable or unwilling to solve such a problem and equally unwilling to ruthlessly eradicate a failed experiment as he had done before. Perhaps this is a passing reference to one of the lost legions, that they were ruthlessly eradicated after having demonstrated some sort of genetic flaw in their gene seed. There are also veiled references, though no outright evidence, to link a proto-legion to the Emperor's later and eternally sealed genecraft project to create the Legio Custodes, their involvement the Labric Polaris incident, or the aborted Redacted experiment which has long been the subject of dark rumor. What this last bit of information refers to is not known. In the Horus Heresy, Book 7, Inferno by Alan Bligg, under the list of the Space Wolves campaign, The Darkest War, it makes mention of the Rangdan Xenocides, which took place in the 860 of M30. When the Great Crusade's forces breached the eastern fringe of the galaxy, they attracted the attention of the Rangdan Cerebrivores, a species of such macabre power and technological might it seemed, for a time at least, that the Imperium had met its doom. The book goes on to say that the Imperial forces suffered losses that would not be exceeded until the dark days of the Horus Heresy. Whole expeditionary fleets went to their deaths without a single survivor, worlds were laid waste, dozens of Titan legions were obliterated, and by the end, entire Space Marine Legion's Redacted section had been lost to the Imperium. This information perhaps indicates that possibly one of the lost legions was destroyed during this brutal conflict, though much of the account of this deadly campaign was deliberately redacted and censored from official Imperial records. In the novel Angron, Slave of New Syria by Ian St. Martin, a dreadnought of the World Eaters Legion's chapter who was the former Legion Master of the 12th Legion, tells Centurion Mago, twice before the Emperor has purged his own progeny, and every living soul within the legions that followed them. In the novel Dark Imperium by Guy Haley, while the resurrected Guilliman is having a conversation with the ecclesiarchy priest named Frater Matthew, he makes a reference to the lost Primarchs. I was one of 20. 2 failed. Half the rest turned on my father. The Emperor is not infallible, nor am I. Though this does not explain the exact fate of the 2 lost Primarchs, it does heavily imply that they were deleted from all official Imperial records for their failure for some reason that is other than outright betrayal of the Emperor. In a later chapter, while Guilliman is having a conversation with an artificial intelligence known as the Call Inferior, a facsimile of the ancient Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call that bears the some knowledge of the ancient tech priest, it is revealed that Call has not only been perfecting the use of the new and improved gene seed of the Primaris Space Marines descended from the 9 loyalist legions of the first founding, but he has also been experimenting with the gene stocks of the 9 traitor legions as well. This also included experiments with the gene seed of the lost Primarchs of the 2 legions. This confirms that despite their erasure from history, the gene stocks of both these missing legions still existed, even as late as the 1st century of the 42nd millennium. When Call requested the right to use these questionable gene stocks to found new Primaris Space Marine chapters, Guilliman vehemently refused and ordered the Archmagos to halt his research into the use of those dangerous gene seed stocks. The Call Inferior, Call's proxy machine, replies to the enraged Primarch. The warriors were not at fault. The science is not at fault. Their Primarchs were. Chapters from your gene line have also fallen in the past millennia, Lord Regent, and we do not censor them. This implies that the Primarchs of the Lost Legions were to blame for their respective disappearance from the Imperial record. However, the Call Inferior might have been making a reference to the 9 Traitor Legion Primarchs rather than the Lost Primarchs. In the Lightning Tower by Dan Abnett, while constructing the defenses of the Imperial Palace on Terra in preparation for the coming attack by the Traitor Legions, Primarch Rogaldorn of the Imperial Fists Legion is walking through the palace and comes across a corridor displaying the statues of all 20 Primarchs. The audiobook states that an accident befell them that may somehow be a precursor of what happened to Horus. In the novel Mechanicum, a conversation between Imperial Fist's Primarch Rogaldorn and Malkador in regards to the war on Mars and the heresy states, Horus has 3 of his brother legions with him. You have your fists, and 13 others. Would that it were 15. Mused Dorn. Do not even think it, my friend, warned Malkador. They are lost to us forever. I know, said Dorn, following his terrible wounding on the moon of the world of Davin by the chaos weapon known as the Kindbrak Anathame. The Primarch Horus, in a chaos-induced vision, apparently went back in time to the Emperor's gene laboratory beneath the Himalaysian mountains, and saw the incubation capsule of Primarch before the Primarchs were scattered through the warp. Before the warp rift created by the Chaos Gods opened within the laboratory, Horus put his hand on Primarch capsule and felt it. He stopped by the tank with stenciled upon it, feeling the untapped glories that might have lain ahead for what grew within, but knowing that they would never come to pass. In the 2nd edition Codex, Ultramarines, it states that the 2 legions likely fought for Horus at least during the beginning of the heresy. It also makes reference to the fact that the records of these 2 legions were destroyed following the end of this conflict. However, this conflicts with retconned information provided in the novel The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, in a conversation between Magnus the Red and Lorgar, when they are discussing the 2 unknown Primarchs and the death of both their legions, which occurred 43 standard years before the drop site massacre of Istvan V.